College of Education curriculum, instruction, and teacher education at MSU. His current research interests include student activism and dissidence in Greater China, curriculum theory, educational game design, and Asian Americans in social studies curriculum. Kyle earned a BA in political theory with an emphasis in Asian studies from the University of Puget Sound.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm not going to really get into the paper part of it because if you want to read it, we can talk about it later. But again, my name is Kyle. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Teacher Education. And you may be wondering why a China scholar and a teacher educator is here with you in an exhibit about Latin America. And what I want to share with you today is the idea that protest tactics and aesthetics are more global than it might seem. Sounds pretty simple, right? Not so easy. So I want to start our story in 1989. Berlin Wall falls 30 years ago, recently. China is going through a big change. 2,000 democracy activists are murdered in Tiananmen Square. They are part of a democratization movement that we thought after 1999 was stamped out. China had two responses to the Tiananmen Square massacre. The first is more visible, right? We know about the Great Firewall, internet censorship, and to put it in pretty frank terms, it is the largest project of human censorship to date. What's less visible is one of the more subtle and quiet things that the Chinese government did. It's called the Patriotic Education Campaign, and it was designed to, via curriculum, prevent another Tiananmen. And the Patriotic Education Campaign starts at the preschool level and goes until the end of high school. And what it's meant to do is literally create Chinese citizens in the way that the Chinese government wants them to be created. And so the idea was that if we can create a passive and compliant population that could produce and see the privilege and value in higher education, China itself would be more peaceful and it would be richer. And so you'd think that in this elite space that China's created, its universities, you'd think that there wouldn't be spaces for radicalism. But there are, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I found them. I did interviews with about 55 people over 3 months in China, and we talked a lot about what dissidence needs to look like. One respondent told me really clearly that there's this idea that the academy itself can be a radical space in China despite the censorship. That in academic research, substantive and thorough critiques of the Chinese government can still be made. But as one respondent told me, ordinary people cannot understand your research, and so it's very safe to the regime. But what does it mean when critical research can't get out of the university? And I think this student was as much critiquing our universities and universities around the world. It's not just a Chinese problem. It's about all of us. And so I asked him, how do you think, where's the radicalism in that? And why would you want to give up this position of power and privilege in the academy to do dissident work that'll have you, as one person said, black-bagged and tied up and sent away? And the answer was a really surprising one. This respondent told me that it's about seeing the radical potential and just hanging out. Hanging out. Why? Because hanging out, as far as these students were concerned, meant having underground gay straight alliances, radical queer and trans spaces, conversations about democracy. And they told me that this idea that in protest, martyrdom was not the answer. the aesthetics of resistance needed to look different because China's technologies of violence are different. And so the methods that they laid out were about developing identity. And we think of identity in the US as kind of this divisive thing, right? Identity politics, right? But when identity is a unifying space, when identity can see an interpersonal connection with someone that is in an identity that is completely contrary to what the state wants you to be or how to act, that's the radicalism. And so what a respondent told me, she said that radicalism here exists below the surface, as it does in other societies, but it doesn't look like picket lines. It doesn't look like the conventional riot. It looks a little bit more like disseminating this idea that you can be something else. You can be the other and do so in a way that is both safe and it's communal, that we together can do this. And so what they talked about was this idea that identity is unifying. So by trying to find other people and other places in which we can just be, and the act of being is an act of resistance. There is a radicalism in just existing contrary to how the state wants you to be. And so I think the lesson that I took away from China, and I think is relevant to our higher education institutions now, is this sense that radical dissidence can be subtle, and that subtle dissidence can be radical. That the practice of hanging out might not look like the resistance that we expect. It is being performed by bodies that do not look like ours in ways that do not look like ours. And what this is to say is that if hanging out can be radical, what else is also radical? And so the notion that I was playing with in this paper was that if just hanging out is radical, then we can see our intentional actions, the actions that we take, the choices that we make as individuals can be powerful and are powerful. And when the government, when states like China, like the US, demand that we perform, that we produce, that we consume, rinse, and repeat, just the very act of surviving otherwise is radical. The idea being that the longer that we can persist, despite what the state wants us to be and how it wants us to act, it deflates the necessity of martyrdom. Because we need bodies to survive and persist. Because, to quote Bettina Love, we need to do more than just survive in education. It is about persisting and resisting in the ways of finding ourselves, the people who we think we want to be. And that, I think, is what makes China's dissidence so radical. What was really shocking, though, was how few people believed me in the US. I was really surprised when I presented this paper for the first time. They said, well, you need to show resistance, you need to embody it, you need to live it. How are these kids not living it? When being gay in China is a crime, when calling the mass incarceration of Uyghurs anything but the use of concentration camps and mass detention. How is that not radical? How is that not radical to see the potential in just being and persisting and surviving? And so the lesson I took back from from the people who gave me interviews was this phrase in Chinese. It's 革命到底, which means a lifetime commitment to revolution. Having a lifetime commitment to revolution means that you still have to be alive by the end of the resistance. And so as we consider the ways in which we diversify our actions, diversify our resistance, we can see the potential not just to resist, but to persist and survive. And I think at the end of the day, that is the radical practice of hanging out. So, thank you.